Yes, hello. My name is Hartmut Koenitz. I'm professor for interactive narrative design. I'm also really excited that today we're starting a monthly meetup for interactive narrative design. Here we want to make this a monthly event of bringing people engaged with narrative design together. In that sense, I felt it was very good to start with Michael Bas van Ranj, an established narrative designer, I would say, but maybe we will talk more about that. Hey, Michel, you can start by introducing yourself a little bit.
Well, my name is Michael Bas. I'm the co-owner, co-founder of Ranj Serious Games. And this year it's our 20th year anniversary. A large part of what we do is what we are calling narrative games. There can be quite a lot of confusion about what a narrative game is. And for us, still is a simple way of telling stories using interaction. We work for corporates, so big companies like McKinsey's, the Shells, companies like that. We work for medical world, pharmaceutical companies, but also medical centers like Erasmus Medical Center, and for pure education. Unfortunately, we lost one of the accounts of Zwijsen to the guy over there. Yeah! So that's more or less the area we work in. We do narrative games, not solely. We also do quite a lot of augmented reality stuff. That's more for marketing purposes and stuff like that. And we custom build games for specific goals. And we used to say, most of the time we say that we try to change people behavior, and we try to figure out how we can change them into the right direction. So, is that enough for an introduction?
I think this is plenty, but I think I want to go even further back and ask you a little bit about how did you get into that? How did you decide to make serious games, narrative serious games? I mean, now that you're doing it for 20 years, how did you get into it?
Before we started Ranj, we had a company called Hootsie Kootsie Cartoons. That was, you have to imagine, this was 1990, somewhere around there. We just came from the HKU, image and technology, and we were asked by the VPRO to create an animation series. We never done any animation before that, but we said, yeah, we can do that. So we created from then, about 6 years long, we created an animation series called Purno de Purno. And we really learned to tell stories with that, because we were bad animators. Right. We had to figure out how to do it in such a way that it still was interesting to watch. So we invented a system of different layers. Well, you can still look at it at YouTube. There were several layers of stories in there. So for the very young people, it was just a story like a fairy tale. For the little bit older kids, they could just understand the jokes we made about that. And then in our vision, the older kids, 12, 13, 14 years, would start laughing, and then the younger kids would like, what are you laughing about? That was the whole idea. But we learned to tell stories to avoid animation. That's the whole point. And from there, when we started Ranj, at that moment it was just called Ranj, we started making games. And from that point, in Ranj we never did anything else but making games. Games with a goal, as we called it then, so not entertainment games. We never made one entertainment game. And of course, we started out by using animation and storylines in our games the first time. The more we learned about programming, about the interactivity, stuff like that, the more we got interested also in blurring realities. This blurring realities idea was really big for us. We even once made one of the first story route or a narrative within a city. So this was 2003, 2004, and we created a route in Rotterdam. So in every place where you end up, and then you got these hotspots everywhere, and then you would hear a story. And the longer you would stay on a certain hotspot, the more you would drop down into a layer of absurdness. So you came, so the longer you stayed at a certain point, the crazier the stories would become. But this whole idea of creating stories in reality and having you decide what to do was already there, 2003, 2004. And also one of the more iconic games we ever made is called Shark World, something we made in 2004, somewhere around there. And this was what we call the first idea we had about a narrative game. We created a game where it was all about project management. So you had to learn project management and you had to experience what it was to be a project manager. So we created a game that more or less for the player created project management hell. First thing you had to do was give your telephone number to the system, and then you got a call from your boss telling you that you would have to pick up a project. You have to start in a project that was already half finished. It was somewhere in Shanghai, so a place you don't know, a language you don't understand, people you don't know, and a project you really have to figure out how far it is. So that was the project management hell that we created. And we blended in all kinds of stuff from the real world, like real websites that we used for that. For the people who played it, it was really an experience, a big experience. Just like you can imagine that you have theater and the borderlines, let's say the fort wall is gone, and you really have a mix of reality and stories. That's something that people appreciate. And from there we started building our own engines for this, because we thought this is really cool. This is really cool stuff we've got here. So we've created, based on this system of Shark World, we've created more games, and we're still doing this. The only thing is, now we're running into difficulties in production because it's very costly and it's not that flexible. For example, if you do, most of our projects we do is really agile Scrum stuff. But you can't do that with a production that uses, for example, video. It's very hard to do because you really have to script it out. You can't just go out and film and then say, okay, let's try this different because let's try this in a different way because this is not the way we want this. This is very expensive to create. We're running into problems with production, but also within believable characters, stuff like that. That also explains the interest of Ranj into artificial intelligence, but also in interactive storytelling.
The company is very much still alive. You're creating things, and you gained a lot of experience in making these narrative things, with narrative games. But at the same time, when we talked previously, and I said, well, you know, you're a very experienced narrative designer, you were a bit like,
yeah. First of all, I'm not a very narrative game designer. We do have game designers that are more able to come up with storylines and figure out how all these branching stuff will work and where the connections are and what the variables will be for certain things. So my knowledge about the narrative games is a little bit more high level, more helicopter view on what we have done. So I would suggest that one other time, in another session, you ask Dennis Haag, for example, or Bruno Jordan to tell something more in depth about the creation of these narrative games, because that's a story on itself already.
But I think that also leads to the question, I mean, what is actually a narrative designer? And how do you hire people? Where do you find these narrative designers nowadays? We talked a bit about your process in this regard.
It's very difficult to find a combination of somebody who can write stories and understands the interactivity. So the first thing is already that within our group of game designers, we have one guy that has the feeling for this, that understands this. So he gets to do more or less all the narrative games. So he's getting more experience and he is getting better and better in writing the stories. But still, we hire quite often script writers to do the specific part of writing dialogue, stuff like that. And that can be very confusing. One of the latest projects we did was quite a big project, and we hired a guy from the UK, a very, very experienced script writer, who also done interactive narratives. And we hired him, but actually I have to say that this went completely wrong, because he still started to think as if this was a film, like a film script. He was writing a film, so it was very good, very thorough, very creative in certain parts, but not suitable for what we had in mind, not suitable for the interactive thing we had. So we ended up with a storyline from his side that was for about 1 hour. 1 hour of video production, so you can understand this making a movie. Yes, it's a complete movie within, and then still you have to do the game part of this whole thing also. Even after 20 years we make mistakes like that. But it also shows that it's very hard to find in one person both competences. Being able to write, being able to create dialogues, and also being able to understand the difficulties but also the possibilities of interaction.
So basically a narrative designer is somebody who needs to understand narrative but also interaction, and somebody who doesn't see interactivity as an afterthought to an already developed linear storyline, basically.
Yeah, and that's the problem. That's everybody talks about it. The big problem, of course, is in a normal story you create climaxes and you really guide the viewer or the listener over a storyline that neatly has these ups and downs, so you can control it. But creating an interactive story is completely different, because there the player is the director himself. So he or she will choose whatever path or whatever route it will take. Then to have still the same experiences as in a directed story is very difficult. So you have to go for different things. So for example, where a very exciting or a surprising storyline, a part of a storyline, can be very good in a normal story. There, for example, maybe discovering something as will be very nice as a tool within an interactive story. So you have to really think different about story, what story is, first of all, and how you keep the player or the viewer interested.
Yes, and particularly engaged, right? And also, I mean, one thing, I'm co-teaching with Christian, who's also here, a seminar on interactive narrative design right now. And I mean, one of the things that we're saying is think about not being an author anymore. Think about being a system designer, somebody who creates room for experiences by your audience, but your audience has agency here, can change things, and might do things that are surprising to you.
That's the difficulty, of course, because it feels like it's two different ways of entertainment. The normal way of telling stories or looking at a movie is you sit back, you're relaxed, you're letting everything happen to you. The focus point is decided by the maker. Whereas the experience and interactive story is much more active from your side. So all the rewards, for example, are different than in a normal movie.
Right. Yes, and I mean, I think there's several different ways to talk about it. One way is to say, well, normally you let go of disbelief when you encounter a novel, when you see a movie. Yeah. But actually with an interactive narrative, there's an active creation of belief. To a certain degree, it's a contract between the audience and the designer. And the audience also needs to do their part in creating a good experience. At the same time, you really need to make room for the audience to do something, to have agency, to feel that they can change certain things.
That's a very interesting thing. This whole idea of suspension of disbelief is, of course, in the traditional stories, it's created by very meticulously building a character, for example.
Right.
But you don't have the time in an interactive story because you don't know where it's coming from. Maybe the player will meet this character just in an instance after it's being through a different route or something. And how do you create this suspension of disbelief then? So that's it's very interesting stuff.
So probably we've all seen Bandersnatch right now, right? Which is of course interesting because I think for many people will be the first introduction to interactive narrative, for better or worse. But I mean, I found one particular comment, Terry, to that very interesting, where somebody said, well, you know, this was a terrible Black Mirror episode, but it was a really good game. And I think that talks a bit about the difficulty of sort of expectations. If people expect the same sort of coherent storyline from a TV episode, and it's marketed as a TV episode, we get into a problem here. But if it's marketed as an interactive experience, then people come with a different perspective and a different set of expectations.
You can try something completely new, as we tried when in 2003 with this narrative in a city. That was really at that time it was very new and people didn't know what to expect, so they were very open and very happy to experience these things. And still you can do, I think you can do quite a lot if you have some novel interaction types, if you find some novel ways of interacting with people. I think it will be very beneficial for you if you also try to connect with reality, because that is something that typically a normal traditional story doesn't do. So this connection, making connections with real life and the here and now, so that is also extra material for you to surprise people. And within surprising, you have most of the time people are very willing to go with you. So maybe there it is a part of the suspension of disbelief if you're looking for it.
Yeah, and I think this also speaks about, I mean, I think sometimes there's a bit of a danger of seeing interactive narratives as sort of deficient narratives, right? But actually there's extra opportunities here, and that's what you just said. You know, you can do exciting things that you cannot do with a movie, that you cannot do with a novel. But there was one more point I wanted to come back to you in terms of, well, the market for narrative designers. What I find, you know, interesting, and maybe you can also say something to that, you find job ads for narrative designers, but there's not really an educational program, there's not a degree program for narrative designers. I mean, we have degree programs all over the world, for example, for game designers, but not for narrative designers.
I come from a time where even game design was not an occupation. So in the early 90s, it was there were no game designers either. So it's not more than logical that whenever there's a new area to explore, that you have to wait for a while to come to create curricula for that specific stuff. But for the interactive narrative design, I think it's time that this starts. Yeah.
Right. Well, we're working on that, and I think I can now, well, I can now announce that I think since yesterday we can say we have a first minor.
Ah, cool.
Or we will have a first minor. Turn, is that correct to say?
That is correct, yes.
Yes, okay. So we will have, starting in fall, we will have the first minor in interactive narrative research at HKU. And that is the first start towards the trajectory of, you know, we hope we will be able to create a master's program.
Michel, I worked with you at your company for 1.5, 2 years-ish, something-ish. And we worked on this game, not sure if it was like the best game you ever made.
I don't remember which game it was. What game was it?
It was a second language learning game. I forgot the name too. Checkout. It was called Checkout. Yeah. See? Yeah. The thing with Checkout, it was
a fantastic game. Yeah,
it was a fantastic game.
No, it
What
wasn't.
kind of cool about? I think it was the first multiplayer point-and-click adventure game that I ever played. In that sense, I always feel that Ranj is always on the forefront of new innovations and new steps, because you always do things not always the right way, but you try, right? And I think that's an.
At least we have the guts to say that we can do stuff and still try to do things. And sometimes you succeed, and quite often you don't.
I think this game in particular, because I did a lot of research on it. We went to a lot of schools, play it, did like validation, whether or not it was valuable for learning. We found a motivational thing. I remember vividly that children were playing this game while the fire alarm was ringing and deafening my ears, but they were still playing. It's kind of weird. So it's better than any other thing. The most valuable thing about this game was not so much the whole narrative that was in the game. There was this thick women who wanted to have stuff, and you need to find it somewhere, and then you have to, right? You made
the story. The basic storyline was you were with a group of other students, and you were stuck on an island, and you had to get off there. And to do this, you had no money anymore, and so you had to earn your money to get off the island.
But the game was so badly designed that you always got lost in the game, right?
Yeah, so that was the challenge.
That was the challenge. So what happened in the chat channel was that people were talking like, okay, where is that fat lady? Where is she? Well, she's up, down, go to the left, go to the right, and then straight on, straight on, straight on, and then right. Because they couldn't speak Dutch in the chat channel because it was all scrambled. And because they were in English class, they always spoke English in it. What I found fascinated by it is because of this sort of accident in game design, they actually learned A1 of the European framework of second language acquisition. I think this is the best narrative design you can ever make, is by creating a system where people create stories for themselves. Do you still do this with the new games you design? Because you hire these expensive writers, right?
Actually, we shy away quite a lot from that, because user-generated content is, you can't control it. That scares us. That scares us, because how do we know what they are doing, and how can we, for example, how can we have them follow a curriculum if they can just go on doing stuff for themselves? That's more or less the strange thing about this phenomena of having people create their own stuff. I do love it. I do love the idea that they can create their own stuff. So we tried very lightly. We tried stuff like that in other games. For example, in the autism game, we tried to have them create their own answers. But still, you need a system to see what they are answering, and if you want to give feedback, it has to make sense. So you have to understand what they are answering back, and then already you're into a system of language recognition, speech synthesizing, stuff like that. And
but since you want to control it all, right?
Yeah, but that's because you want to control the content. We are serious game designers. Maybe it's not that interesting or that scary if you're just making an entertainment game. Right. But we do have a task, and our task is to create something that at least have the player learn something or change his behavior and stuff. So for that, I need control.
What would a game, a narrative, in the sense of Minecraft look like? Is that even possible?
This spot I cannot think of it, but it should be, if this is something you're after, you should sit down and start thinking, okay, what would a storyline or what would a narrative game like Minecraft be? How would it look like? And then don't shy away from crazy ideas and just try it out. We're working now on a game that is still a narrative, but leaves quite a lot of room for user participation, user input. We do this for training young medical students. And we came up with a system that is done by telephone and WhatsApp. And we're trying to, actually it's a game where we give some people some information and others not. So that they have to talk to each other about this in order to do the things they have to do. It's a very simple. I can't explain it in detail because we're still building this, and I still have no right to talk about it. But that's for me. It's an interesting new start on a narrative, because it's still a narrative. We still script a part of it, so there's still some I call it a branching tree stuff in there. But quite a lot of the experience will be created by the players themselves.
Well, thank you. I'll just give the room to someone else. Yeah.
Hi Michel, I'm Mark. I'm working with Cortex Arts. It's a bunch of boys, indie devs, trying to build a platform for education. Yep. What I was interested in is whether or not you're busy analyzing your narratives in the way that you look on them where the best branch is made. If you understand, like what I mean.
Having data and then analyzing the data,
even more into the story itself. That the storyline provides a couple of moments where you can make different branches. Yeah. I suppose. Is there any analysis from Ranj or any other party?
We create backlogs of most of our games, so we collect data, and typically we do this on this decision points. For example, in a narrative game we do this on the decision points, so we know which branch people take. So we can also see what is a favorite route to take for a certain point. And of course you want to have a nice for example, let's say we've got a part of a storyline and we branch out. Ideally you would have an even spread of choices for the population, so that part of the population goes that way, part of the population go that way, part of the population go that way, part there. If you see that one answer, for example, or one route is not taken, then there is probably something wrong with that route. Okay. So in this case, that we do. But that you're actually these faults, as I would call them, you see quite soon in the productions already.
Okay, so that won't occur in the final product.
Yeah, they're still there. So And sometimes we force. We also have something that we call fluff. So sometimes we create fluff routes just to fill up the idea of having our own agency. Yeah? That the player is in control.
Yeah.
So for the sake of the storyline, we say, well, we can't branch here. We need to go down because we have to reach this point.
Okay.
And then still we give some fluff, and then we
But that's
guide them back to the.
But that's very important what you're saying, because that means that you always come to the same bottom line.
Not always.
Not always.
No, not always, but sometimes it's necessary to do that. For example, if there's one, and also here there's the idea of having you're making a serious game, so you want some stuff to be part of the learning experience.
Yeah.
Let's say
Sure.
that I have a company and they have created 7 leadership principles. I at least want the players to experience these 7 leadership principles. So I don't want them to branch off and not experience one of them. So that's why.
Yeah, of course.
That's why we force sometimes stuff.
You have to have them to follow one path, at least one path. But
yeah, now we have. It's not paths. It branches all over the place, and there is also variables that can change. Where we talk about story arcs, so we've got small parts of storylines created, and they are connected to each other. And where you end up is dependent on choices you made. For example, several steps back for. So it's a little bit more complicated than just branching.
Your data collection provides information on how the branching is done.
Yeah. Afterwards, yeah. Then we can see how people play this game.
And then you know what they have learned.
No, the best way to get a grip of the stuff people learn is by designing it that way.
Okay.
So we design a path, we design a game, and we say, okay, point A, B, C, D, E has to be reached by everybody.
Okay.
So there you see that sometimes we force people, they wander off and come here, and then we force them back to point A because we want to be sure that you have experienced point A.
I'm Christian. I'm researching interactive narrative experiences. That was my PhD, and I'm working with Hartmut now at the professorship. And nice to meet you, and congratulations, 20 years, quite impressive. What do you think constitutes a good user experience when it comes to serious interactive narrative applications? And where do you see the strength in using these?
Yeah. Well, actually, this is a good question. I should have asked myself this more. What is a good user experience if it's about a serious game? First of all, we think it's very important that the goal of the serious part of the game should work. So if we set out to change your behavior, then we want to see that this behavior is changed. That's first of all, we want to reach that. So that's the serious part of it. Then the experience that you have as a player should be joyful, and what we want to have you experience is this idea of suspension of disbelief, that you, for a moment at least, you're willing to forget that this is just a game, and that you're doing something that can make you angry, can make you happy, or can make you feel like if you're walking on clouds, for example, for just a short time. I would like to give an example. One of the things we recently tried out as a pilot, this was for the medical students thing. We had them play. At the end, they were so psyched up, so really that they were really tense that the teachers that were already also there during this pilot, they said, well, we have to do some kind of evaluation now because they are too tense to get out of the game. But we were like, yeah, great, we reached this goal because we had them really immersed into what we were trying to bring, that we forgot that maybe that's giving this very strong experience is not the way that you want to leave them after the game was finished. So that is actually what we as game designers are after, giving you a very strong experience, whether it's sadness, whether it's happiness, whether it's whatever, as long as it gives you some feeling.
And how do you evaluate whether it had the desired impact?
Well, also two ways. The desired impact on what you want to reach should be there by design, so you also know how to measure it. You could do a zero measurement and then later on do another measurement. For some behavior you can really measure it. So you just look at the behavior before the game and then look at the behavior after the game. And there are different ways, of course, you know. Within research you can have, it goes all the way from just having some analysis on data you collected to complete randomized control trial that takes 4 years to do so. Sometimes it's necessary, but I shy away a little bit from the very expensive and big RCTs because it takes too long time to do this, and whenever you change something you can throw it in the garbage anyway. Yeah. So very simple ways, very how you call it, right down to the earth ways of seeing what is happening.
What you do is you change behaviors, and you said that you hopefully change behaviors for a good behavior. Yeah. But who decides what's a good behavior? The player? Do you decide? Or your client decides?
Yeah, no, that's the ethical question, of course.
That's the ethical question.
And it's the same question you have with nudging. Huh? So can you nudge people towards good behavior, and who decides what good behavior is? Yeah. Sometimes it's obvious. If you nudge people or try to change people's behavior into a more agreeable and being a nicer person, nobody would disagree. You have to be very careful. I do believe in the power of using games and psychological tools to get people to do different behavior, to behave different than they normally would. But I also believe that it's not a panacea. It's not something that works 100%. So there is always this part in everybody's head that says, well, not for me. I will go along this whole route, but not for this part. So we can only reach a certain amount of behavioral change with our techniques.
Hi there. My name is Rudolf. I'm a freelance narrative designer. And my main question is of interest. What do you feel is the most appropriate or the handiest tool / format to use for documenting interactive nonlinear stories?
A tool?
Yeah, like do you use
we
Twine,
do have
Excel, like what is it?
No, we do have our own tools. We created, yeah, but that's actually quite special. We do have a story engine, and we do have a dialogue engine. These two belong to, not the same thing, but belong together. They started out as some kind of a spaghetti machine where game designers could plug in different parts of storylines. So we do have our own tools. We created them a long time ago, more than 15 years ago. We started building them. They have succeeded over several platforms. Like I think we started out in not in Director, but we started out in Flash, and they are now being translated to Unity and HTML5. But still the same principles in the same editors. So that's what we use. So we don't use third-party software for that.
It's a quick follow-up question. Do you feel that it's necessary to have like a standard format for
it becomes so complicated, so complex if you don't have anything. If you want to do this in Excel, well, luck to you. But you have to have a mind like this to grasp all these different things and the route you've taken as a designer. So you need something to visualize what you have done. That's the most important thing, I think. Yeah.
Greetings. I'm Joris Rudolfs from Greetings Games. And I was wondering, do you market interactive storytelling games different from traditional games?
The thing is that the decision on what kind of game we make is most of the time based on the question we get from our clients. So for certain stuff, well, maybe I give you an example that explains it at best. Quite a lot of questions from the corporate world is about what they call compliance. In the corporate world you have to comply. Banks have to comply to laws. Pharmaceutical companies have to comply to laws. And it's very hard to do for employees because, first of all, they are trained to sell and are not trained to be very compliant. And secondly, it's utterly boring. So the matter of law, compliance law, is very boring. What we do in such a case most of the time is Let them experience something they will never experience, but is a real risk. Because one of the biggest problems with compliance is that the short-term gains are high. So you get this, well, I sold several projects and I've done this and this. So short-term you'll earn a lot, and even with bonuses, stuff like that, think banking. But the risks are long-term and not that often occurring. So the best way to create some sense of urgency within the brains of these people is to have them experience what happens if this risk that's long-term happens. And it's big shit. We're talking, yeah, but we're talking not millions, but billions of dollars that are at stake at that moment. Let them experience it. Let them experience it at a personal level, not at a company level, but they've done this and they are. And so we create stories for that. And story narrative games are really good for these experiences because they are immersive. They bring you into the story, and if we create this suspension of disbelief, you're there. You get very angry if it happens. You get excited if this happens. So the game we created for one of the pharmaceuticals, about 60% of the people don't get the optimum score, and they feel cheated. But that's what happened in real life. They get cheated in these decisions they make. They made the wrong decisions, but they're not that obvious. And so we created a complete story where this happens to you. And of course, the odds are a bit higher now because we created it, and they experience that they made a mistake somewhere in the line, and then they feel really bad, and then you can be sure that they will be a little bit more careful in real life also.
Hi, I'm Niels, freelance narrative designer. I previously worked in studio, and at some point you get to this point in production that you have to make compromises. But as a writer or narrative designer, you have this deeper meaning that you want to add to your story, or you want to have this depth or this meaning to it. But the moment that you start explaining it to the team and saying like, well, but if we do this and this and this, there might be a couple of players that have a deeper experience when they play the game. Yeah. It doesn't weigh as heavily to like cutting some budget or having more assets. How do you develop strong arguments as a narrative designer to still back this up, or
I'm on the other side.
How do you counter these arguments?
Which arguments convince you?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, first of all, it should be, if the effort is minimal, like say, okay, we don't have to create new assets, we don't have to create new footage, for example, but we still can make a change in the experience, and that will deepen the feeling for X amount of people. That would be a good argument. But the argument is, of course, the costs that are involved to do this. If you say, well, I can reach 2% of the players with a deeper experiences and it will cost about 80% more money, then I will say, no, you can't do that. But if you turn it around and you say, well, for a little amount of extra money, I can reach for about 80%, I can have a deeper meaning. That will be great, yeah.
Well, like the challenging bit, because you can never say like 2% or like percent.
No, but you can guess it.
Like, yeah, of course. But because it's so subjective, how could you, or like how could you test it so you know how many people you would affect?
We could see what people get to that point. First of all, that is possible. But you never know what the effect will be unless you specifically gonna ask them afterwards. So you can do test teams and then ask them what they experienced and what they liked most. You could, on forehand, also test your ideas. You have to do this in some kind of a paper prototyping phase and just experience. And still, this is a very cheap way to, let's say you're a writer, you're a creative, and you have this idea and you say, well, this is going to work. My idea is going to work. I've got this idea, and it will, if we create it in such a way that 50% of the people will see this, they will have this very strange but big experience that will help them to understand this problem better, for example. The best way to convince me is if you say, well, let me try it. Let me try it. I'm going to do this on paper. I ask 10 people, and we just see what happens if we, just you reading stuff, for example. That's a possibility to test your ideas. And if you then, 5 of them, had this very great experience and then come back and say, well, you can compare them. So 50% had not the exact experience, and the other 50 have, and of the 50% that had that experience that you were designed, and they say, well, this was great, and the rest said, well, it was nice, but not that great. Then you convince.
Well, I mean, thanks, Michelle, so much for coming here and for giving us so many interesting insights in your practice. Thanks everybody else for coming. I want to end by saying this is just the beginning for us. This is the first event. It's really to be the Narrative Design Monthly. So come back, spread the word, talk to us, leave comments on Facebook, on Twitter. Talk to us also about things we can do in terms of research. And I'm really, really excited that we started this. And I think we will continue. And I can already announce our next guest for the next monthly meetup. He's also here tonight. He's Roy from Wistfire. He's in the back here. So you see we already have a continuation going, and Roy will talk about giving character to characters, and I'm really looking forward to what he has to say. So see you in a month.